Welcome to part 2 of my attempt to show how house prices really track over time and why they move the way they do. If you understand what drives house prices, it will help you understand where we are today and what the next move is likely to be. For starters, let's admit that trying to track house prices from the way back in the dim and distant past is a hopeless task. The average person would probably earn nothing, and there would be no houses for sale anyway. Back in the Middle Ages, you worked for yourself and paid taxes to the lord of the manor. Those taxes would be paid in kind. There were no shops and almost no merchant class. Work meant subsistence farming. You worked to feed your family. Clothes were made in the home from local materials. Your home was probably built by a group of villagers, and the village belonged to the lord of the manor. The first real tracking of money, house prices and wages began round about the middle of the 17th century. If we look at the stats from 1700 onwards, the charts show almost nothing happening. House prices barely moved from one end of the century to the other, and wages and interest rates stayed the same. The inflation rate for decades tracked in at 0.1% per annum. Servants in the big houses earned £1 a year. Of course, they got their board and lodging, but the only money they earned could scarcely be used for anything other than small purchases. What this meant in practical terms is that the average Joe didn't go out and buy a house. Most people rented, or maybe even built their own. We've already seen in a previous blog what happened to house prices adjusted for inflation in the 19th century. Here's the chart again, this time compared to earnings. Not only a massive drop all the way down till 1920, but even the recovery still sees prices lower in relation to earnings. So we have a century where hardly anything moved, followed by a century when house prices just didn't go down, they plummeted. What is really interesting is what happened in the middle of the 20th century. That is when things changed drastically, and that is what most people have seen and use as their perspective on house price movements. But, and I need to stress this, what has happened over the past 50 years is not normal. And here's a long-term chart of US house prices, inflation adjusted. Hardly any change over 130 years. In fact, slightly down, as with UK prices. The real change came during the late 50s and early 60s when improved economic conditions gave the working classes disposable income, and Prime Minister Harold Macmillan famously boasted, "You've never had it so good." At the same time, financial institutions started developing new forms of financing which made mortgages available to a much larger segment of the population. With modern, sophisticated lending schemes, people no longer had to buy a house. Instead, they could get a building society to buy it for them and drip-feed the purchase price via a mortgage. These innovations made an enormous difference to the house price trends. Look at this chart from the Bank of England. Now look at the chart for house prices tracked against wages. This shows what happened when mortgages allowed more people to buy. They were roughly tracking wages up until the time that mortgages started taking off. Then look what happened. Add to this something nasty that happened to purchasing power at the same time. Look at this chart of inflation during the 20th century. This is a new problem. We have never had anything like this in previous centuries. If you look back at the 18th century's prices, you will find they're stable, but so is the cost of living. The one thing that stands out is that the 20th century was the century of rampant inflation. The price of potatoes rose, the price of a pound of milk rose, the cost of a motor car rose. Why would you not expect the cost of a house to rise as well? For most of the century, that is exactly what happened. House prices roughly kept pace with the marching tide of inflation. If we look at the relevant charts, we will see that house prices generally track inflation. There will obviously be movements either way. But what has happened since the mid-20th century is that two things have converged. First, during the 70s there was a massive spike in inflation. Second, from the late 50s onwards, there was the move towards modern mortgage facilities, which gradually percolated through the whole of society over the course of the next generation, changing the whole basis of house price valuation. No longer did you have to gauge whether you could pay by looking at your bank balance. From now on, you could look at your monthly income. That meant that house prices suddenly became affordable to the majority of people, and there was a rush to buy, and therefore a surge in prices. There was yet a third situation that led to higher prices: hedonic regression. What that means is that a car back in 1950 might have cost you £500. A similar model 10 years later would have cost more. But that car would have contained far more sophisticated equipment. It may have been slightly larger, had a more powerful engine, and used less petrol. In short, the hedonic theory would claim you were getting more bangs for your buck, so the real price of the car had not really increased. As the century progressed, we found that house prices surged, but they also gradually got better at keeping out the cold. They gained bathrooms, indoor lavatories, electricity, telephones, and other fixed appliances. In other words, houses became better machines for living and contained far more facilities. That is one reason they became more valuable, and therefore more expensive. You are buying more than you would have done a century earlier. All these forces are only likely to come together once, or at least once in a lifetime. Don't expect there to be another such surge unless circumstances once again change drastically. There may well be house price crashes, followed by recoveries. If you are an investor and want to make money out of real estate, then you'll be looking forward to the next crash. Once the dust has settled and prices have stabilized at the bottom, start to enter the market and buy as much as you can. Otherwise, make sure you're buying for the right reason. Let me quote again from Bob Beckman. Remember, your home is your nest, not your nest egg. Well, in the next video blog, I will start to go through the various important indices that will tell you the real state of the housing market. Until then, thanks for watching. Do click the like button below. That does help the algorithms to push my blogs to the top of the search engine. In the meantime, stay safe and see you next week.